Now that we've talked about what an MVC framework is in general, how it differs from DOM manipulation libraries like jQuery, and even a bit about when to use one versus the other, the obvious next question is, why Angular? So let's talk a bit about some of the attributes of Angular that make it such a good option for use as a front-end MVC. Angular follows a very intentional pattern of being data-driven. Everything is declarative from the beginning. This means that at no point will you ever say or program something similar to, now, go find all elements that match some arbitrary selector that's been chosen for a specific data property and update them based on this new value. Instead, when we write our HTML, each element or collection of elements gets to declare what properties they are bound to. Some of these by nature will be read-only, and some will both read and write to that property. Again, we declare those details by the elements we choose and the attributes we give them. And to reiterate the nature of an MVC, this means that any time the value for a property changes, all those elements that have declared their binding will be notified and able to respond accordingly.
To help demonstrate that, let's take a look at what this looks like in Angular. You've seen some of this already with our original examples from earlier. Again, we have a list of people, each one of which has some properties such as a name, profession, and hometown. And then our view will iterate over them to render them in a simple table. Let's take a closer look now at some of the Angular-specific aspects of what we showed before. You can see we have this ng-repeat attribute. We'll see this ng prefix throughout nearly all of Angular's built-in directives. We'll talk more about directives at a later stage, but for now, just be aware that they are how Angular knows what each of these HTML attributes indicate for a specific node. And the ng prefix is just the shorthand they've chosen to namespace all their directives that come out of the box. This kind of namespacing is certainly a convention worth following, particularly if you're planning to release your directive for other developers to use, but it is not in any way required for the directive to function. As you might expect, what the ng-repeat directive declares is that this HTML node and all of its children will repeat or iterate over a collection of some sort. In this case, that's just a basic list or array. If you've ever written a for loop before, you'll likely recognize this syntax. We're simply saying for a collection, in this case, people, loop over each item and give me access to each instance under a specific name, in this case, person. And if you look at our JavaScript over here, you'll see that we do in fact have access to this people array as we received it from our AJAX call. It's attached, however, to this scope property, which is important to note. Any property that you want to be able to use in the view needs to be attached to this object. We'll cover where scope comes from and some of its additional properties in more detail as we go forward. But for now, just be aware that it is the interface between our data and our views. Also, recognize the declarative nature of this directive. We are simply telling the HTML to bind itself to a list and then repeat over each item. And you can see, if we look at our rendered HTML, how the list does in fact correspond directly to our array that we've received. This is in contrast to the jQuery implementation from earlier that required us to imperatively inject DOM nodes into our document as we explicitly looped over the array. Now instead we can just declare that this element is bound to a list, and Angular takes care of making sure that's accurately reflected. Once inside our repeating node, we can see even a couple more declarations, such as the person's name or profession, or even up here where we attach the class of their profession to the top-level list item. Here, just like all the other instances, because they're bound to the data property itself, rather than us having to keep track of them and imperatively update them once we notice that a value has changed, they update automatically as they read the value from the true master of record. This double bracket syntax that you see here is Angular's way of providing read-only access to a property. We'll cover later how to have read and write access, but when all you want to do is output the value of a certain property within your HTML, these double brackets will serve.